Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can, Nicole.
Great.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name's Nicole. I'm the Training and Quality Manager at the MSC. You would have received your meeting invite from me or maybe one of my colleagues. And I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we hand over to Leah. So let's get started. Okay, so if you are struggling, if your internet is or your Wi-Fi is failing, here's a few tips. If you can close any tabs on your browser or apps that you have open, that will just help strengthen your Wi-Fi, as will turning off your video. That will also help. We ask that you mute your mic unless speaking, and use the chat box for your questions, or you can note them down for the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And we really hope that you do engage in the question and answer session, because there are really no stupid questions. We want to hear all types of questions, because I'm sure if you're thinking it, someone else will be thinking it. I'm just going to show you some features in Teams now to help you if you need some assistance with translation. So let me just stop sharing for a second and show you these features. If everyone can still see my screen. Okay, can you still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so if you can see these 3 dots here, so what you're going to do is you're going to click on those 3 dots. We're going to move right down to turn on live captions. And now you'll see text at the bottom here. And what you need to do then is to click on this little wheel and select which language you want that in. So I'm going to switch it to, I think, let's do, I don't think all of the languages are here, but some of them are. So you might be able to find yours. So let's say, let's go for Japanese, that'd be fun. And so as you see, the language will change to Japanese, hopefully. Voila. Yes. And another thing that you can do to help you as well is that you can ask for the presentation to be translated as well. So whatever is being shown, it might be because there's no presentation being shown right now. But again, in here you'll be able to click a button that tells you, that translates the actual presentation for you, which will, as I said, I think because there's no presentation being shown, I can't find that feature right now. But let me once Leah gets started with the presentation, I'll take a screen grab and I'll put it in the chat for you to show you where to find that feature. And without further ado, I guess it's time to hand over to Leah.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to upload, start sharing the presentation. In the meantime, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, Leah.
Okay, perfect. So we'll just give a minute for this, the presentation to load. Okay, can we see the front screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. My name's Leah Buckley, Senior Social Policy Manager at the Marine Stewardship Council. And today I will be taking you through the MSC labor requirements that you and your business may be required to comply with as part of your chain of custody certification. And in this, over the course of the next hour and a half, I'll give a little bit of background on why we have undertaken work in this area. Could I ask people to mute their mics, please?
Sorry, I just muted everyone, but I think I've unmuted you.
Perfect, great, thank you. So as I was saying, I'll give you a little bit of background on why we work on labor requirements and how the requirements came to be, a little bit on the fisheries side, but mostly focused on chain of custody today. So just before we start, just to give a bit of disclaimer on this PowerPoint, it was developed recently and it's aimed at organizations that are certified to the MSC chain of custody standard that will need to comply with the labor requirements, i.e. those that are standard risk. Nicole already went through the housekeeping, and just to note, we have received a number of questions in advance. Sorry, I'm just going to have to get that back up. So we have received a number of questions in advance, and I'll be going through those at the end of this presentation. But if you do have any questions throughout, please put them in the chat box, and that is being monitored by Nicole. If you also have any technical issues, you or any of your colleagues, you can also use that chat box and we can start to help you. To start off with the MSC position on forced and child labor, the MSC condemns the use of forced and child labor and recognizes the increasing importance of social issue when considering sustainability overall. As a third-party certification scheme, we're constantly looking to improve our program, and particularly on social issues, we will continue to work with other organizations engaged in trying to develop measures and approaches which are outside the scope of our environmental program to address human and labor rights issues within the seafood industry. We are principally an environmental standard. Our fishery standard is focused on environmental sustainability, and our chain of custody standard is focused on chain of custody and traceability. Our mission is to end the global crisis in overfishing, which is threatening the world's fish stocks. At the moment, we don't currently have the expertise or remit to provide a social standard or a standard for social welfare for fisheries and the seafood supply chain, and the policies that we put in place have helped address some of those risks and concerns without going and developing that full standard. We have been engaged in providing solutions since about 2014, and since then we have introduced a number of policies across the program. Our first requirements were introduced for fisheries and chain of custody in 2014 that excluded any entity from the program who had been prosecuted for forced labor violations, and that exclusion was for 2 years. In 2018, we introduced a new policy for vessels and at-sea supply chains.
Unknown participant is now joining.
For a self-description, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. In 2019, we introduced a policy on labor practices in supply chains, land-based supply chains specifically. And in 2020, due to the COVID pandemic, we released a number of derogations, and our MSC Board of Trustees met and reiterated a direction to continue working with others on labor issues and making use of the expertise that we're seeing around the world, as well as to investigate the potential use of grievance mechanisms. Labor practices at sea, the requirement that was introduced in 2018 is that all MSC certified fisheries and at-sea supply chains are required to publicly report on the measures being taken to address forced and child labor. They report on these measures through what's called a self-description template, where they're asked a series of questions of how they might be managing various issues that relate to that are indicative of labor risks. So they report on how they're mitigating these risks, and those reports are all found on the MSC website in the Track of Fishery section of our website. For labor practices on land in the chain of custody program, the requirement is that some certificate holders will need to provide assurance that there is no forced or child labor in their operations. And this is done by completing a third-party labor audit, so that's the requirement that was released in 2019, or completing a self-assessment on labor practices. And that requirement was introduced in 2021, again, owing to the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. For those that do choose to complete a self-assessment, it does come with the agreement that a company may be asked to complete a labor audit if they're called on to do so by the MSC. The derogations. So as I mentioned, when the COVID pandemic started when it really kind of took hold globally in March 2020, what we saw was a near virtual suspension of in-person audits, both for fisheries and chain of custody in the MSC program, but also for social compliance programs around the world. Because of this, it was not possible for our certificate holders to comply with the labor requirements. So we released our first derogation in March 2020 that said that any company who might have needed to comply with the labor requirements did not have to do so. So it basically delayed the effective date. Then, in early 2021, when that original derogation was getting ready to lapse, so was coming up to expire, we saw that there were still uneven implementation of availability of social auditors or CoC auditors around the world. Companies and governments still had restrictions that limited travel or access to facilities. And we felt that just letting that derogation lapse would be quite difficult. And may be challenging for some of our partners. So what we did is we came up with a revised approach that was released. It's called Derogation 7. And that gave our partners two options for complying with the labor requirements. Either you could complete the labor audit per the requirements that are already in our chain of custody standard, or if it might be difficult for you to complete that labor audit, instead you could complete a self-assessment and agree to an audit if MSC makes that request of you. And just to note, if MSC, in the event that MSC did make that request, MSC would pay for that audit, so that would not be on you. Because, with fluctuating, virus levels and everything like that, we didn't want to set another timeline for this. The self-assessment does come with other benefits, such as helping us better understand labor practices and supply chains. So we released that. It became effective in May, and it will remain in place until the release of the next standard. So there's no expiration date on that option for you. So now I'm going to talk you through the requirements. For those of you who may need to complete the labor audit requirements, it will be based on two different factors. If you have any of the prioritized scope activity, so if your CoC certificate includes processing, and that can be primary, secondary, preservation, any type of processing. Any packing or repacking, or manual offloading of products direct from a certified fishery or farm. So if your certificate, your chain of custody certificate, includes any of these activities, including as subcontracted activities, you will be required to comply with the labor audit requirements. But you may be exempt from that if you're classed as lower risk according to 2 or more globally recognized indicators. You don't have to worry about determining or kind of assessing your risk level. Your chain of custody auditor will be able to advise you on that risk level, so whether you are lower risk or standard risk, and they will do so annually. If you do want to look at the risk criteria, it is in the chain of custody certification requirements, table 5 and 6. And if you do need to comply with the labor requirements, it's a 2-step process. So step 1 will be at your initial audit, and at that point, you'll be asked to provide a signed copy of the Statement of Understanding of Labor Requirements, a copy of which you can see on your right, and that is also available on the MSC website. The purpose of the Statement of Understanding is to confirm that you understand the labor requirements and agree to complete the labor audit or self-assessment by the time of your next CoC audit. The reason that we've introduced the Statement of Understanding is to give certificate holders a chance to review the labor requirements and determine the best approach for you. Social audits can take a while to organize, and so we also want you to have the space to think through that best option, particularly given the speed at which the turnover at which some companies do get CoC certified. So we don't want to stall that process. Step 2 will be at your next audit, so your first surveillance audit. At that point, you will have completed a labor audit, or you will have completed a self-assessment. That self-assessment is on the right. I'm just going to ask if people could stop taking control of the screen, because that then I lose the presentation and I can't see it anymore, and I don't have control. So we will be making a copy of this presentation available to you after this call, but if you do have any questions or anything, if you'd like me to go back to a different slide, just put a note in the chat, and Nicole will raise that question, and we'll get you any of your questions answered. So step 2, at your first surveillance audit, that will be when you'll be asked to either show evidence of a labor audit or show evidence of your completed self-assessment. And because there are 2 different tracks, what I'll do is I'll take you through each of those options in detail, starting with how first completing a labor audit and what happens in that case. If you're opting to complete a labor audit, it must meet a few criteria. The first is that it would be held on site. Now, of course, there are exemptions, COVID exemptions allowed in this. For example, SEDEX has developed a virtual assessment tool, and that has been developed by SEDEX and meets the criteria of a robust audit as determined by them. So in that case, we do accept that virtual assessment. The audit must be conducted by an independent third-party auditor, so it can't be an internal audit, for example. It must be a labor audit program recognized by the MSC, and I'll go through that a bit in a minute. And it must meet the performance criteria of the relevant labor audit program. So each program operates slightly differently, so we've had to accommodate that by specifying the criteria that are required as a minimum performance level for each program. And something I haven't mentioned yet, but is worth noting, is that we do all of these documents, so the MSC third-party labor audit requirements, the self-assessment form, the Statement of Understanding, all of these documents are available in multiple languages, including Bahasa Indonesian, Thai, Vietnamese, and Mandarin. So you can use those translated versions to help better understand the requirements and to complete anything, complete MSc requirements in your own language. So currently there are 3 recognized programs, and I'll explain the 4th after. So the first is the Amphori Business Social Compliance Initiative. The second is Social Accountability's SA 8000 Standard. The third is the SEDEX Meta Audit. And the 4th are SSCI recognized schemes. So SSCI, I'll explain in a bit, but it is a benchmarking program. And so although there are not yet any approved schemes, we will eventually recognize any social compliance program that gets that SSCI recognition. We are expecting the first of those SSCI recognized schemes to come through probably later this year or early in 2022. The Amphori Business Social Compliance Initiative started in 2003, and they've rebranded in the past few years as Amphori. The Amphori Code of Conduct is 11 principles, and it operates with a continuous improvement model, which means that there's no pass or fail like you see with MSc certification. Instead, they have a rating system from A to E, with A being the best and E being the lowest, upon which those 11 principles are evaluated. In addition, they have a number of what are called zero tolerance issues for what they consider to be the most serious labor violations. And that includes things like forced labor, presence of forced labor, presence of child labor, and a couple others, for example, bribing an auditor. So what they see is really intolerable activities. The Amphori model is a membership model. So membership grants you access to the Amphori platform, but it's also restricted to where there are active relationships between a supplier and a buyer. And how it works is that their model, again, is this one of continuous improvement, so that buyer participation is really important to them to help so that the buyer is also invested in supporting their suppliers, conduct the audits, but also improve over time. So it does mean, however, that the Amphori platform is not open to any company that would like to join. It requires that relationship in place. In terms of MSc compliance, paper copies of the report are not accepted. So what we do require is that you, as a company, will need to log into the Amphori platform while your CoC auditor is on site and navigate to the relevant parts of the platform to show your auditor that your Amphori audit does meet that performance criteria. And if you'd like to have a bit more detail on what that is, it's available in the MSc third-party labor audit requirement document. But we've also developed a training module for auditors that actually visualizes the platform as screenshots so that you can help guide your clients on what they need to do. Also, in terms of MSc compliance, non-conformities that are not zero tolerance issues do not impact the MSc chain of custody certificate. So again, on the left, the A to E rating. So if you have an E rating against one of the principles, that would not impact your CoC certificate. You would only have a non-conformity raised against your MSc certificate if there was a zero tolerance issue found. The next program is Social Accountability's SA 8000. SAI started the SA 8000 standard in 1997. It's a certification scheme, so it has a pass-fail model, much like the MSc, and it measures social performance in 8 areas. And it's anchored by a management system element. So just like how you have with the CoC standard, is it still showing as Amphori?
It's SAI.
Okay, sorry, there might just have been for the person that raised that, it might be a bit of delay with internet. And it's anchored, going back, it's anchored by the management system element. So much in the same way that the CoC standard has the 4 requirements, and then principle 5 is about the management system, SA 8000 operates in a similar way. In this way, full compliance, so a valid SA 8000 certificate is required for MSC compliance. And the reason for that is trying to adjust or check compliance when there isn't a valid certificate would have been quite difficult and complex. So if you do choose to go with the SA 8000 standard, just be aware that a valid certificate is required. For auditors, compliance, your client's compliance can be verified on the SA 8000's online supplier directory, and links are given to that in the training module and in the other guidance material. So unlike Amphori that has an online platform, SA 8000's, it's all public, much like the MSC, and can be checked remotely. And finally, there's SEDEX META. SMETA stands for the SEDEX Members Ethical Trade Audit, and SEDEX is a supplier ethical data exchange. So SEDEX started effectively to provide a platform for suppliers to host all information on their social compliance efforts to make it easier to share that information with multiple buyers and reduce the duplications that you sometimes get when different buyers are asking for different things. Like Amphori, SEDEX is a membership-based organization with both suppliers and buyers, but it differs from Amphori because in this case, anyone can be part of the platform, including MSC. So MSC has a SEDEX membership, and your company can connect to us as a buyer-supplier type relationship on the platform. The SMETA methodology and the SEDEX platform is also a flexible continuous improvement model and really leaves it open for companies to adapt to their needs. So the SMETA methodology is fixed, but there's no specific performance criteria that is required to be met to be featured on the SEDEX platform. It also, if you have a SEDEX membership, you can upload an Amphori audit, for example, or an SA 8000 audit. So it hosts a wide range of things. Although to meet increasing demands for a certain level of quality of those SMETA audits, they have started to introduce some criteria. For example, now they have a fixed list of member firms that they work with. Just like MSC can have a membership on the SEDEX platform, so can CABs, conformity assessment bodies. So if you do use one CAB for both your CoC and your social audits, you can request a relationship can be requested on the SEDEX platform, which would allow your CoC auditor to verify your compliance online or request that the social audit function of the audit company can check that compliance and pass that information to you. Much in a similar way as Amphori, SEDEX does the SMETA audit will have nonconformities raised against their different the different aspects of their program. But any nonconformities that are not business critical issues do not impact the MSC chain of custody certificate. And business critical issues are similar, just like zero tolerance. They're the issues that the SEDEX team have determined are the minimum performance criteria that they would expect. And any business critical issue does require action to be taken. And business critical issues are defined as presence of forced or child labor, and a couple other, a serious immediate threat to health and safety, and a couple other key issues. The CoC Meta audit comes in two different forms. There's the 2-pillar audit and a 4-pillar audit. The 2-pillar audit covers all of your basic social compliance topics. So things like forced labor, working conditions, discrimination, that kind of thing. A 4-pillar builds on that and also includes criteria around environmental performance and business ethics. If you do a 4-pillar audit, it will meet the MSC requirements, but only a 2-pillar audit is required by the MSC. So I mentioned before that we have performance criteria that we've set, and this is because although it can be helpful to recognize external programs rather than introduce that requirement ourselves, it does present some challenges for certificate holders, for you to know what you need to do and how your auditor can check that. Because they're not all easily black and white pass-fail models, that means the MSC has had to define what we mean by successfully completed, what you need to show, and what your auditor needs to check. So this table 1 that you see on the right is an excerpt from that MSC third-party labor audits requirement document. And in the second column, it lists the performance criteria for the relevant program. And in the third column, it lists what an auditor needs to check and how. And there are some FAQs supporting this table in that document as well. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we have talked it through, but it will be there if you do have any questions after the call. Just the one thing to mention on audit frequency. So they all have different requirements around how often audits need to take place. So we tried to align with each respective program as best as possible. And what we landed with is for M4E, for the MSC, an audit will be accepted as long as it is still valid on the M4E platform. And what this means is that M4E audits can range between every year or every 2 years based on the performance of the organization completing the audit. But because of that engagement with the buyer, the MSC doesn't have to monitor that, and the buyer is evaluating and determining that audit frequency. So as long as it's a valid audit on the platform, it's accepted by the MSC. For CoC Meta, it's an annual audit, and the reason for that is because MSC does not have the ability nor the remit to review the audit reports of every company, every CoC certificate holder that completes a social compliance audit to review and determine their audit frequency. So we don't have that buyer-supplier relationship, so we've had to set an audit frequency ourselves, and we put it as annual. And for SA 8000, their audits can range, I believe, from around every 6 months to every year. So we're less concerned with when the audit happened and more that there's just a valid SA 8000 certificate in place. So as long as there's a valid certificate, we know that the audit frequency set by SAI is being followed. Did I see a hand pop up? Does someone have a question? No? Okay. If you do think of it after, just pop it in the chat box. So if you complete a labor audit, what would lead to a nonconformity? So your business may get a nonconformity if you haven't completed the labor audit in the time frame, so that by that first surveillance audit. If your labor audit is expired or invalid, or if you completed your labor audit but it does not comply with the MSC third-party labor audit requirements, so that table 1 that I showed you 2 slides ago. and the CAB was notified within 2 days, and I'll explain that in a minute. You risk suspension in the case where a major nonconformity was raised by your MSC CoC auditor and not closed out within 30 days. Or where your labor audit was completed, did not comply with the relevant conformance criteria, but the CAB was not notified. So what we mean by this is to align with the labor audit programs that we refer to, who all encourage improvement and working with companies where an issue is found. What we've said is if you fall out of compliance with your labor audit program, you can avoid a suspension of your MSC certificate if you notify your CoC CAB. So as long as you notify them of the issue, they will raise a nonconformity against you, and that gives you 30 days to close it out. If an issue is found and you don't notify your CAB, then you risk suspension, and that will be for a minimum period of 6 months, or potentially longer if it takes you longer to close out the issue. So in this way, we really try and encourage transparency and information sharing, and that as long as you are open, that you can maintain your MSC certificate while you work to resolve your issue. Next, I'll be moving on to completing a self-assessment. So now we've finished talking about what is required if you do a labor audit, and now we'll look at this new option of a self-assessment. If you choose to complete a self-assessment, it must use the template provided by the MSC. So you can find that on the MSC website, but your auditor should also share a copy of it in advance of your CoC audit. The self-assessment should be completed annually. Even if there are no changes in your business, it will still be completed annually, but you should aim to account for any changes in your certificate. So for example, if you've added new sites or activities, or maybe your business has undergone some changes and you've introduced new policies or processes. So account for any of those types of changes. We don't set how you respond to the questions in the self-assessment isn't being assessed, so you're not graded on how well you answer a question, but we do ask that you complete the self-assessment to the best of your ability. So thinking through how things work in your organization and what efforts you have underway. Just spend a bit of time thinking about it and do your best to answer thoroughly. The self-assessment will be uploaded onto the MSC database, just like your CoC audit report, but they will not be published on the MSC website. So these will remain internal only and can only be accessed by a small number of MSC staff members within the standards team, who will be just undertaking the regular monitoring that we do. Finally, the self-assessment should cover all sites and subcontractors that are part of your certificate. So if you are a processor, you have 3 sites, but then you also use a contract packer, your self-assessment should cover all of those activities at each of those sites. If you really feel that you can't represent some of the activities in your certificate, particularly when it comes to subcontractors that often have, are separate legal entities and may have different processes in place, you can ask your subcontractor to complete a separate template and send that to you, and it can be shared with your CoC auditor. Just to clarify again, the self-assessment forms are not audited. So what your CoC auditor will check is only that it's completed. They will not evaluate the individual responses, nor will you be required to submit supporting evidence to support the answers that you give. So, for example, if you talk about a policy that you have in place within your business, you don't have to share that policy or send it to the MSC. Because some of these questions might be new to some of you, we did put together a guide that you can see on the screen that takes you through question by question with specific guidance and examples of how you might, what we're looking for when it comes to each of these questions. So if you're unsure on how you can answer best or what information we're looking for, that guidance document will hopefully be helpful for you to complete the form. The questions are targeted at kind of 3 areas. So the first questions are targeted on asking you about the policies, any activities or other measures that are taken by your business to ensure no forced or child labor. So this could be, for example, that you have a process for checking identification documents to make sure that staff meet the legal minimum age. They'll also ask you about the presence of certain risks and how these risks are mitigated. For example, temporary migrant labor, laborers are often more vulnerable than domestic or full-time contracted workers. So if you use temporary migrant labor, you will be asked to answer some questions on how you recruit businesses, how you recruit workers, and how you ensure a decent working conditions for them. And finally, there are a couple questions that are more reactive. So for example, any policies, tools, or other measures that will help you respond if a concern is raised. I'm sorry, someone's trying to take control of the screen, but I'll just ask that you hold back from doing so, because it prevents me from being able to control the presentation. So some points that we really want to drive home are that there are no right or wrong answers. You're only asked to give a bit of information and background based on the circumstances of your individual business. That might mean that some of the questions aren't relevant to you, depending on your business and the employees and workers that you hire. For example, if you don't use temporary migrant workers, that question would be less relevant for you. If you're ever unsure about what a question is or how you comply, you can note this in the additional details column. So you can answer yes or no to whether a risk is present, but you can provide some details to say, okay, well, I do this, which I think meets the criteria, but even if you're not sure, you can just add it in, and that will help us understand. And as I mentioned earlier, no nonconformities will be raised based on how well you did or did not answer a question. Do I have a question from someone?
Yes, Leah, we have a question on completing the labour self-assessment audit. Not the self-assessment, the actual audit. And it's about so for COVID, a lot of schemes have put in kind of other measures to say if the audit can't be done, essentially. And the question is, can they use the last information for the last audit for certification? But I think, will you be addressing that at the end, or do you want to cover that now?
Yeah, I can talk that through now. So yeah, in particular SEDEX, but the others as well have developed a number of tools to help companies where an audit might not be possible. This can include a virtual assessment, but they do also have a number of risk tools to support kind of mapping and risk assessments and stuff in the absence of an actual audit. They're all great tools. We're limited to an extent in our ability to recognize those tools. So what I would say is if you're a business that would normally complete a SMETA audit, but you haven't done so, then I would probably recommend, like if you haven't done so because of COVID, I would recommend you do the self-assessment, but in your answers, you can just refer to the tools, the risk assessment tools or whatever that you have been working with, whether on request of your buyer or for your own kind of monitoring purposes. So you can just reference those in the self-assessment, and that will give us an indication of the activities that you have underway. I will move on, but if we do want to talk about this a little bit more at the end, I'm happy to do so. So the next thing is I'm just going to give you a couple examples of the self-assessment questions and the type of guidance we provide. So question number 6 of the self-assessment is, does the certificate holder or site, as appropriate, use recruitment agencies? And please describe the typical methods used to recruit workers. So if you answered yes to this question, if your business does use recruitment agencies, we would like you to include kind of a rough estimate of how many migrant workers that might be recruited into your business and that might be handling seafood product annually, and particularly how many of those workers are on temporary contracts. And if you answered no to that question, then what we just ask is you provide any other information that you feel is relevant on the efforts that you have underway. And migrant workers can refer to both foreign or regional migrant workers, and this can also include, seasonal workers or those hired through contractors. Another question in the self-assessment is question number 8. Does the certificate holder or site, as appropriate, have a process in place to ensure no debt bondage or costs are imposed on workers related to their employment? So if you do have a process in place, we ask you to describe those policies or practices. And examples of what you might have in place that you can talk about include comprehensive service level agreements, any commitments your business may have made to initiatives like the employer pays principle that says that employers will assume the cost of all recruitment related costs, or details of any legally permitted contractual costs paid by foreign or other migrant workers to gain employment at your site. If you don't have a specific process in place, that doesn't mean necessarily that you don't do anything. So even if you answered no, we'd still encourage you to provide any other information on efforts that you have that you feel are relevant and help ensure that there's no debt bondage within your workers. And we also provide some examples of costs that are related to debt bondage. So this can include things like placement or brokerage fees, costs related to travel to the workplace or visas, medical costs, charging workers for safety gear or other clothing or protective gear needed to do the job, food at the workplace, access to communications, so phones and such, remittance fees, or repatriation costs. So the presence of one of these aren't necessarily indicative of debt bondage, but this gives you an example of the types of costs that can be put on workers that can create a debt bondage situation that we are hoping to avoid. And the reason that we focus so much on foreign or migrant workers is because these are the type of workers that are often at higher risk of debt bondage. So they're more likely to, they're in a foreign country, they might not understand the language or the legislation or their rights, and are more vulnerable to exploitation. I mentioned earlier that if you choose to complete a self-assessment instead of a labor audit, you might still be asked to do a labor audit. And this is just for monitoring and control assurance purposes within the MSC. So we may commission a very small number of audits at random, just to get an understanding of what's happening in those organizations that are completing the self-assessment, and to check that the information is lining up between the two. These audits mentioned will be done at random and will be paid for by the MSC. If you are selected for one of these audits, we will be available to answer any questions you have, and we will also be briefing your auditor so they'll be able to support you in the process. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I have some common FAQs, common questions here, and then I'll go through these, and then I'll move on to the questions that you submitted in advance, as well as the questions in the chat box. So a common question that we get is how much and how long is a labor audit? And this is quite a difficult question to answer because the time and cost of a social audit varies quite significantly based on the size and complexity of the business. So a bigger business will require more time to complete things like factory inspections, document reviews, and staff interviews. Staff interviews are a big part of a social audit and do require more time the more workers that are employed at that business. In general, Amphori BSCI audits take between 2 and 4 days, and SEDEX Meta mostly take 1 or 2 days, but can take some additional time for a really big facility. While SA 8000 audits take a bit longer, these can take upwards of a week or so. And the cost of the audit will depend on how many audit days, as well as local auditor availability. So they have to bring someone from a different part of the country or even internationally. What other recognized schemes or review of them are in the pipeline? So the SSCI launched in early 2021, and there are a couple social audit schemes that work in seafood that are getting ready to or going through the process. So one example is BRC, the British Retail Consortium. They developed an ethical trade and responsible sourcing standard, and BRC audits are quite common in the seafood industry. So they're going through SSCI recognition. It's open for public consultation at this time, so they'll probably, if successful, they'll probably receive that recognition towards the end of this year. And when that happens, MSC would have a process in place to recognize any of those social audits as meeting MSC requirements. So what happens if you don't comply? If at any point you don't meet that labor performance criteria, your CoC cab must be informed within 2 working days, and then you'll have 30 days to address the issue and close out the nonconformity. And if you do not, there may be a risk of suspension of your CoC certificate. Is a remote or virtual labor audit enough to meet the third-party or labor requirements? And the answer is yes, as long as that virtual assessment process is developed and approved by the relevant labor audit program. And an example is the SEDEX virtual assessment tool. For self-assessments, does it have to be completed in English? We will accept self-assessments completed in languages other than English, so that includes Bahasa. But to make it easier for us, we would ask that any of those be completed and submitted as Word files rather than written out. And the reason for that is just we will be relying on Google Translate for a lot of the translation work within the standards team, so it just makes it much easier for us to be able to translate that material and read it if it's done in Word, as a Word or PDF file. Do I need to submit supporting evidence to my responses, such as copies as policy? So no, we really just want to reiterate that. You only need to submit the self-assessment form. You do not need to share any other documentation with your CoC auditor. And how often does the self-assessment need to be completed? So it should be completed every year, although you may not have, there may not be any changes in your responses to some questions between a year and the next, and that's absolutely fine. You can reuse the answers that are still relevant for you. And who would pay for a labor audit commission by the MSC? And so The MSC will commission these random audits, but we will assume the costs of those audits. I will be circulating this PowerPoint at the end, but this just gives you a list of some of the supporting material that we've developed to help you understand the requirements and help you meet them. And a number of those materials are available in multiple languages. And I think the others, including the self-assessment guidance, will be translated in the coming months as well. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I think I can go first to the questions in the chat box in case I need to show my screen and go back to the other slides, but then afterwards I will share the other questions that were submitted in advance. Nicole, could I get your help maybe?
Absolutely.
To read those questions out. Thank you.
So I think we addressed Nasira's question earlier. So let's move straight on to Ilim's question. We did cover it in the chat box, but I think it would be great just to reiterate. So do the MSC CoC cabs already, are they already notified and socialised about the self-assessment tools? And then the second part of the question is, what if a company has used their grace period for the social audit in their first year of MSC CoC certification, and then the next year, the second year, they choose to complete a self-assessment instead? Is that possible?
Yeah, so all MSC cabs have been notified of this derogation, and all supporting materials have been shared with them as well. So they should be fully aware and versed in these requirements and be able to advise you accordingly. Yes, and on the second question, if you completed that statement of understanding with the intention to complete a social audit, but then you decide that a self-assessment is more appropriate for your business, you can absolutely just do the self-assessment. We would just recommend notifying your CoC auditor so that they can prepare the audit accordingly, so that they're going to know what they need to ask you for and how much time to budget for that.
Great, and then we have another question in from Zulfi. Are the labour audit requirements also required for suppliers to CoC certified fishing companies?
By that, do you mean whether the CoC requirements apply to fisheries, to vessels? Because I'm not sure I understand the question. Oh, sorry.
I think that's the question, yes. But Zulfi, if you could maybe just clarify whether it's CoC or fishing vessels.
So I can start. So the requirements for fisheries is not that they do not have to complete an audit, a labor audit, but they do have to complete a self-assessment. And that self-assessment is, well, it's a self-description. So similar to how CoC has a self-assessment, the fisheries have to complete a self-description. But no labor audits are required of fisheries at this time, and that's in recognition of the limited number of kind of globally applicable social standards for at-sea activities. And then just in case that wasn't your question, the requirements apply to anyone, any certificate holder, chain of custody certificate holder that processes or packs or offloads fish as part of an MSC supply chain. Or ASC, I should say as well.
Great. So we don't have any other questions in the chat box, so I might suggest that we look at some of the questions that came in as part of the registration form. Oh no, okay, we've got some more coming in, sorry. So we've got another question from Elim. Is it open for other companies? Is there specific benefits if we want to conduct self-assessment but do not intend to complete MSC CoC certification?
Well, I suppose those are benefits that you can evaluate within your business. I think what we're seeing a lot of is, a lot of corporate social responsibility programs within big seafood companies, but also legal requirements in countries like Australia and the UK, where larger companies have to undertake due diligence and reporting to the governments on efforts to mitigate modern slavery risks. So in that case, you might want to use the MSC template for either fishery or the one for chain of custody to help you navigate and understand what types of risks you might want to be looking at within your business. So all of our templates, as with everything else, are available on our website. So you can use them as you wish, but whether there's a benefit in doing so would really depend on your specific circumstances and how you engage with those that are requesting more verification of the sustainability of the seafood that you handle.
Okay, and then we have another question in, what's the deadline for self-assessment, and would it be extended in case the factory is temporarily suspended due to COVID-19?
We did have a number of businesses that in the early stages of the pandemic in 2020 that were closed entirely or had significantly reduced operations and staff on site. And so combined with the inability to get someone on site, we did delay those requirements. So last year the derogation said there was nothing you had to do. Now we've let that lapse, so you do have to do something. So if your site is closed or operating at reduced capacity, we would still expect you to do a self-assessment. And this can be reflective of the current circumstance, so the operations as they are at this moment with your business, to reflect, again, that reduced operations, and then you can do another self-assessment the following year when your business is back open and operating closer to normal. But at this stage, we do not have in place an exemption from complying with them at all. So you do at least have to do that self-assessment, which can be done even if your business is closed, because it's based on policies and practices and how you hire staff and things like that. So that should be possible even if your business is still closed.
Then we've got one on debt bondage scope. So if the site offer the employees lunch with low price, is that considered debt bondage?
No, that wouldn't necessarily be. No, that would not be considered debt bondage. That would be a normal justifiable cost. What I mentioned on that slide is these are general indicators of debt bondage. So an example where food prices may be indicative of debt bondage is if workers live on site and are only able to buy food from one store, and that store is selling at incredibly inflated prices that workers are struggling to purchase. So on its own, it would not necessarily be an indicator of debt bondage, but it's something that you would just make sure. So if affordable food is offered, then that is fine, but how you just make sure that stays within reason. But yes, just confirming in that specific case, no, that would not be an example of debt bondage.
Great. Okay, we don't have any more questions in the chat box. So if questions do come to mind, please pop them in there. And if there are no more in the chat box, maybe we can look at some of the ones that came in as part of the registration form. Oh, sure. Kevin's got his hand up. Sorry. Before we jump to that, Kevin, what's your question?
Hi. My question is about the auditor's responsibility. I know the self-assessment form has no right or wrong, but if the auditor finds the form is not completed yet, or most of the questions are not answered, will the auditor request the site to complete before the audit, or SC will be raised?
Yeah, it's a great question. So your responsibility as an auditor is to take that self-assessment, check that it's completed, and upload it onto the MSC scheme database. If you do see that the questions are not answered, that means the form isn't complete and you would raise a non-conformity. So they have the chance while you're on site to answer the rest of the questions, but if they choose not to, you would have to, you would raise a non-conformity and they would have 30 days to complete the form and get that back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got a question about how to upload the self-assessment form onto the MSC database. So I guess, yeah, you can speak to that.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I should clarify. So you as an auditor typically don't upload all the documents into the scheme database. Usually there's an admin person at your cab that uploads the audit report, the CoC audit report, and you would just pass the self-assessment to that admin person, and they would upload the self-assessment when they're uploading the CoC audit report. So you just pass those materials to your cab manager, and they will get it onto the database.
Okay, I've said this a few times. Oh no, here we go. Here's another one. So they were certified just this year, so 2021 summer. Would they need to have a labour audit before July 2022, or the self-assessment is sufficient?
Yeah, so if you had your audit in July 2021, you should have signed a statement of understanding, and so that means by your next audit in July 2022, you will complete a labor audit or a self-assessment. So you have the choice to do one or the other, and a self-assessment is sufficient. And I think someone also asked about the deadline. So there's no specific deadline for completing the self-assessment. It's just by your next audit. So if your next audit is July 2022, you complete your self-assessment on around July 2022.
Okay, we've got another one coming in. Is the statement of understanding only applicable to choosing third-party labour audits?
No, the statement was developed when only labour audits were an option, so in 2019, but it is a requirement for those that will complete a self-assessment as well, just to make sure that you don't get to the audit the following year, the surveillance audit, and your client is not prepared, or the company is not prepared.
This is a good one. With the pandemic, is there a possibility that that the labour audit will be done virtually?
Yeah, we do. From our conversations with the labour audit programs that we recognize, particularly in the case of SEDEX and M4E, a lot of those in-person audits have resumed because virus levels are low in a lot of their countries of operation. But of course, this varies and is a bit uncertain the extent to which that will continue. But you do have a number of companies that particularly in the second half of 2020 and the first half of 2021, were taking advantage and completing virtual assessments. While we're just in the interest of time, please continue adding your questions to the chat, but I'll start with a couple that were submitted already. So the first is, what are the MSC's third-party labor audit requirements? So you can find those in the Chain of Custody Standard, section 5.7. We also have a new document, the MSC Third-Party Labor Requirements document, also available on our website, that goes into a bit more detail about the different criteria. And then we have Derogation 7 on our interpretations website. The link is in the PowerPoint that has the updated version to allow for a self-assessment. What do I do after I finished the MSC CoC labor self-assessment? So once you finish that, you can share that with your CoC auditor, and they will get that uploaded onto the MSC database. Generally, does the aquatic product industry do the SMETA 4-pillar or SMETA 2-pillar? I couldn't say with certainty, but in my understanding, the 2-pillar is much more common. 4-pillar is quite an advanced social audit, again, looking at environmental criteria and business ethics. The 2-pillar is much more widespread, but 4-pillar may be for those companies with really advanced sustainability policies or commitments. Next, if the auditor finds an obvious violation of the labor requirements during the visit, for example, if the auditor finds child labor on site, while the organization chooses to complete the self-assessment form, shall the auditor raise a nonconformity and report to the MSC, and if so, how? So because we wouldn't be able to for you to raise a nonconformity as an auditor, because it would be beyond the scope of the self-assessment, but if you do see indicators or presence of forced or child labor while you're conducting the CoC audit, we would strongly recommend that you report that to the MSC, and we can investigate further and look to see if there's actions to take. Yeah, so if you do encounter this, please do share this with us, including any evidence, and we can take this up, but this would not be for the CoC auditor to investigate. Next question is, I'm interested to understand how the MSC labor requirements align with the SEDEX requirements. So MSC's focus is on a reduced scope of issues. So we're focused on forced and child labor only, whereas the SEDEX requirement deals with a wider set of social responsibility issues, including things like the core conventions of the International Labour Organization, ILO, to include things like working hours, freedom of association, discrimination, health and safety. Whereas MSC is focused at this time on forced and child labor only. Next, does a trading company require a labor audit, and are there any exemptions for small processing plants to have a social audit? Let's say workers less than 20. So for companies that do trading only, no, a labor audit is not required. The labor requirements only apply to processors and packers, not to any traders or wholesalers that don't have processing and packing in scope. We don't currently have exemptions for small processing plants, but that being said, you have the choice to choose a self-assessment instead. So if you're a small processing plant, you have less than 20 workers, you might not have any buyers or anyone asking you to do a social audit in your normal business. So in that case, it may just be a better option for you to do a self-assessment instead. Next, does this requirement replace or is it able to become a substitution for the current social audits, such as SA 1000, SEDEX, META, etc.? So with the release of the derogation, how it basically works is in the current chain of custody standard, it says you have to do an audit, and the derogation has superseded that requirement in the CoC standard to say you can do an audit or a self-assessment. So in a way, it's replaced, but it's just giving you an extra option for how to comply. And what that will look like longer term, beyond the release of the next version of the standard, is still to be determined. We are doing some work underway, but we will have more information for you in the coming months. But rest assured, for the moment, that self-assessment requirement is in place, option is in place for the foreseeable future. I'm going to go through a couple more questions. How are any labor issues going to be policed within fishing vessels? How can what happens on the ocean be policed without 24/7 observation? What is the plan for fishing vessels, and what about privately owned fishing vessels? So it is a great question. We have the self-description in place for fisheries that I mentioned earlier. In terms of assuring the absence of forced and child labor on fishing vessels, this is quite difficult because of the challenges in undertaking normal social compliance that we're able to do on site. Getting an auditor to actually witness vessel activity when the vessel is far out at sea is quite challenging. Right now, we also have work underway. We're looking at what is our future direction on labor issues for both fisheries and chain of custody. We don't have anything agreed and in place just yet, but again, we will have more information probably in early 2022 on what we hope to achieve on the vessel side of things, and you'll be invited to input on that and share any thoughts on our proposed direction and the tools that we think will help in this area. And I'll read one more and then we'll go to questions in the chat, and I can finish the rest after. Should employers pay attention to the rights of workers outside of working hours, such as mess facilities? I think within the scope, so social audit programs will ask about on-site living conditions if workers live on-site, and they may ask to see those. For the self-assessment form, also if you have workers living on-site, in provided accommodation, you may wish to share any information on those living conditions and any fees related to it, and just how you ensure decent standards for your workers. So in some cases it may be relevant, and in some cases it is not relevant. I have a few more questions here, but I'll go back to anything in the chat box.
We don't have anything in the chat yet, but let's maybe give it a minute or so.
Okay, I will continue with these questions, but yeah, happy to answer anything else that you guys raise. We have a question here about the Vietnamese trade union, noting that it's not an NGO, but most enterprises have to engage with the union as a legal requirement. So would it be regarded as a workers' right group in question 2 of the self-assessment form? And I would say yes. I think you can speak to any engagement with workers' rights groups, and that includes any trade unions, whether or not they're affiliated with a government agency. Yes, you can refer to that as a group that you are engaged with. Is there any cost for this training? No, all of our training is provided for free. Someone asked to know the details about the requirements, and asked that maybe MSC can share some case studies from our experiences, which would be a great help. I do hope that this will be provided through the new guidance documents on the self-assessment form that we developed, as well as the training modules that Nicole has created. So in there, we do have some case studies and examples and detailed guidance. Another question, permanent employees who have worked for decades feel disadvantaged by the new regulation, PP 35 UU-CK, which reduces their rights and severance pay. Is there a solution so that employees are not too disadvantaged? If we regulate the PKB, then what is the legal basis? Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with this regulation or the country that it belongs to, but I would just say personally that this would also severance pay would be outside the scope of the MSC standard, so we wouldn't be in a place where we could advise on what you could do, except that you could look at materials and different ways that you can support workers, and any policies maybe that you could introduce to help ensure their protection. But yeah, severance pay would be outside the scope of the MSC requirements. And as a standard setter, we can't specifically advise on how you might approach this. And then someone asked for a chronology of MSC labor standards, chain of custody, and the requirements. So we do just have that short slide going from 2014 to 2020. It is quite high level, but if you're interested in something a little bit more detail or a specific format, just let us know and we'll see if we can help you with that.
I've had another question come in the chat. For question 6 in the self-assessment form, the form refers to migrant workers, both foreign and regional. And we just want to confirm the scope of what regional is within the country. So the country specifically is Vietnam. What does regional look like? Although I know that might be a very specific question.
Yeah, it is, and I don't think there's any. There's no specific definition for what constitutes a regional migrant. It varies quite significantly between countries and how migration and labor laws might work across different provinces or states within a particular country, and how that might affect the rights that different workers are entitled to. I don't know the specific context of Vietnam, so I wouldn't be able to speak, but in general, when we talk about the vulnerabilities of regional migrants, it could be where worker where they may not have, oh, sorry, I dropped for a second. So I was saying where we would generally define regional migrants as where workers from one part of a country go to work in another part of the country that is less familiar to them, where they may not have local connections, where there may be different labor laws or even languages. For example, India has many, many different languages. Migrant workers may face challenges in communicating or understanding contracts between those different regions. Or the other way is where regional migrants may live in on-site accommodation, where they're dealing with those costs associated that can lead to debt bondage that I mentioned earlier. So where they could be potentially exploited through the process to actually obtain that work and get to the work site.
Okay, we've got another question from Kevin. If the organisation cancels their certificate and applies for certification with another CAB, will it be treated as a new applicant signing the statement of understanding, or shall it apply to the second audit?
So in that case, it would be treated as a second audit, as long as when the organization had their original CoC certificate with that first CAB, if they completed the statement of understanding at that point and the CoC audit, then there will be an entry in the MSC database. They will have completed that initial audit, and if they cancel their certificate and go to the next CAB, then the second audit requirements will, so those surveillance audit requirements will apply. So they'll have to do a labor audit and a self-assessment. And I understand this is a bit challenging for you as a cab, particularly if you are that second cab. To monitor this, we are trying to improve how our database makes that information accessible so you can check whether there is a previous entry. And certainly if you're having any issues, you can take that up with your cab manager or share that with MSC. If you're seeing this happen frequently, for example, that's something that's helpful for us to know, because there could be some changes that we could make to the requirements to tighten up that process and prevent that cab jumping to avoid complying with the requirements.
So we do plan to wrap up in 5 minutes. So if there's any final questions, just please get them in, either raise your hand or get them in the chat box, and we'll get those answered.
And if you think of any questions after the webinar, do feel free to contact your local outreach representative, or you can email socialpolicy@msc.org, and we will be able to respond to your questions. But I do want to thank everyone for joining this call today. It's been a great session with lots of really good questions. I really appreciate the active participation of you all. And I know it was a lot of information to take in, particularly for those who are relying on the automatic translation. So, you know, hopefully receiving these materials after this call will also be helpful for you to do another review and think some of this through. Thank you very much.
Okay, I guess we can maybe close up and give everyone 3 minutes back.
Great.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.